Picture yourself nestled in the most comfortable place you know. Perhaps you're in bed with soft pillows cradling your head, or maybe you're in a favorite chair with a blanket wrapped around you like a gentle embrace. The world outside is quiet now. The day's demands have faded like distant echoes, and you have this moment just for yourself. Take a deep breath, slow and easy, and as you exhale, feel your shoulders drop, your jaw unclench, your body settling into perfect stillness. Tonight, we're going on a journey together, you and I, traveling back through time to a place where the land meets the sea, where ancient stones hold centuries of secrets, and where something mysterious once happened that continues to whisper through the years. This is a story that asks nothing of you except that you listen with a quiet mind and an open heart. There are no puzzles to solve, no questions you need to answer. Simply let my voice be a gentle companion as you drift toward sleep, carrying you to the windswept coast of Cornwall in the year 1887, where a church bell began to ring by itself, calling out across the moors and over the waves to listeners both living and perhaps something more. Close your eyes if they're not closed already. Breathe deeply, and let us begin this journey into the mysterious, the unexplained, the beautiful darkness where stories dwell. Whispers beneath the moor, the bell that rang alone. A coastal church in Cornwall, 1887. Part 1. The Landscape of Mystery. The year is 1887, and if you could stand on the southwestern tip of Britain, looking out over the gray-green Atlantic as it stretches toward the setting sun, you would see a land that seems to exist slightly out of time. Cornwall, that ancient Celtic kingdom thrust like a finger into the sea, has always been a place apart. Even in the late Victorian-era, with railways connecting its market towns and telegraph wires strung along its lanes, Cornwall maintains its otherness, its sense of being not quite England, not quite anywhere else, but something uniquely itself. The landscape here shapes everything. Imagine moorland that rolls and dips like frozen ocean waves, covered in heather and gorse that turn purple and gold with the seasons. Ancient granite tors rise from these moors, weathered into fantastic shapes by millennia of wind and rain, looking for all the world like sleeping giants or the ruins of some pre-human civilization. Stone circles stand in windswept fields, erected by people whose names and purposes have been lost to time, but whose presence is still felt in these enduring monuments. Bronze Age settlements, Iron Age forts, Roman remains, medieval crosses, all layer upon layer of human history pressed into the earth like pages in a book. And everywhere, always the sea. The Atlantic Ocean surrounds Cornwall on 3 sides, and you are never more than 15 or 20 miles from its sound and smell. The coastline is a drama of tall cliffs and hidden coves, of rock formations carved by waves into arches and caves and towers, of beaches that disappear at high tide and reveal themselves again when the waters retreat. The sea gives and the sea takes away. It has always been so. In 1887, the sea is still the lifeblood of Cornwall. Fishing villages cling to every sheltered cove, their stone cottages ascending the slopes in tight clusters, their harbors filled with wooden boats painted in bright colors. These are working harbors, smelling of fish and tar and salt, where men leave before dawn to work the waters and return, if they return, with the day's catch. The fishing is hard and dangerous. Every village has its widows, every churchyard its memorials to men lost at sea. But the sea is not the only industry here. This is also mining country, specifically tin mining, an industry that has existed in Cornwall since ancient times. The Romans called these lands Cassiterides, the Tin Islands, and came here to trade for the valuable metal. By the Victorian era, Cornish tin mines are the deepest in the world, shafts descending hundreds of feet below the Earth's surface, some even extending under the sea itself. Miners working in darkness beneath the ocean floor, hearing the crash of waves through solid rock above their heads. The engine houses of these mines, the landscape, tall stone chimneys marking where pumping engines once worked to keep the shafts from flooding, where steam engines hauled or to the surface, where generations of men descended into the earth and many never ascended again. Some of these mines are still working in 1887, but many are already abandoned, their shafts flooding, their machinery rusting, skeletal reminders of the boom times that are already passing as cheaper tin is found in other parts of the world. This combination of sea and mine creates a particular culture in Cornwall, a culture of men who face death daily, who understand their own fragility in the face of nature's power, who live close to the edge between life and death. In this proximity to death, this constant awareness of mortality, creates a culture rich in belief about what lies beyond. The Cornish of 1887 are practical people, pragmatic, hardworking, but they're also deeply superstitious in ways that educated Victorians from London or Manchester might find quaint or even primitive. They believe in the knockers, those mysterious spirits of dead miners who tap in the darkness of the shafts, sometimes to warn of danger, sometimes to lead miners astray. No one admits to believing in knockers during daylight hours, but in the darkness underground, when you hear tapping that comes from no human source, belief comes easier. The miners leave offerings for the knockers, small portions of their lunch, scraps of candle, showing respect to the spirits who share their subterranean world. They believe in piskies, the fairy folk who can lead travelers astray on the moors, making them walk in circles for hours before releasing them, confused and exhausted, miles from where they intended to go. The remedy for being pisky-led is to turn your coat inside out, which breaks the enchantment, and every Cornish person knows this, just as they know not to walk alone on the moors after dark, not to offend the little people, not to disturb the ancient standing stones. They believe in mermaids and sea spirits, in ghostly ships that appear before storms, in phantom bells that toll beneath the waves where the lost land of Lyonesse is said to lie drowned. They know that certain families have the gift of seeing what others cannot, that some people can foretell deaths, that dreams sometimes show the future, that the dead do not always rest easy, especially if they died violently or far from home. These beliefs are not separate from their Christianity. Most Cornish people in 1887 attend church regularly, the Anglican Church of England being the established religion. But Cornwall has always had a complicated relationship with the church. Celtic Christianity came here long before the Roman version, brought by Irish and Welsh saints in the 5th and 6th centuries, and something of that older, more mystical tradition persists. The parish churches are named for obscure Celtic saints whose stories are half forgotten, but whose holy wells still receive offerings, whose feast days are still observed. And in the Victorian-era, another religious movement has taken deep root in Cornwall, Methodism. John Wesley preached here with great success in the 18th century, and by 1887, Methodist chapels outnumber Anglican churches in many areas. The Methodists brought a different flavor of Christianity, more emotional, more focused on personal salvation and the direct experience of God, and this too feeds into the Cornish spiritual landscape, creating a complex mixture of ancient Celtic belief, established Anglican tradition, and fervent Methodist revival. It is into this rich, complex, mysterious world that our story arrives. The year 1887 is significant not just for Cornwall, but for all of Britain. This is the year of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, marking 50 years since she ascended to the throne. Britain is at the height of its imperial power, ruling over a quarter of the world's land surface and people. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," is literally true. British ships sail every ocean. British goods are sold on every continent. British culture and language spread across the globe. Yet even as the empire celebrates, there are signs of change and challenge. Other nations are industrializing, competing for colonies and trade. Social movements are questioning the old order. The working classes are organizing for better conditions. Women are beginning to demand political rights. The certainties of the Victorian age are starting to crack, though few yet realize how profoundly the coming decades will transform the world. In Cornwall, these grand imperial concerns feel distant. Life here is more immediate, more tied to the rhythms of tide and season, more concerned with the next catch, the next pay packet from the mine, the next storm rolling in from the Atlantic. But even here, change is coming. The fishing is getting harder as stocks decline. The mines are closing one by one. Young people are leaving for the cities or emigrating to America, Australia, South Africa, anywhere that promises better prospects than this beautiful, harsh, declining corner of Britain. It is a time of transition, of endings and uncertain beginnings. And perhaps it is no coincidence that in such a time, when the old world is dying and the new not yet born, the boundaries between the normal and the paranormal seem especially thin. In such liminal times, strange things happen, or perhaps strange things are simply noticed more, given more attention, taken more seriously. The specific location of our story, the church I am calling St. Morwenna's, sits on a headland overlooking the Atlantic on Cornwall's north coast. The north coast is wilder than the south, more exposed to the full fury of the Atlantic weather systems that sweep in from America, building power over 3,000 miles of open ocean before hurling themselves against these cliffs. The coastline here is a succession of towering headlands and deep coves, the cliffs rising in places over 300 feet, the sea below a constant roar and boom as waves explode against the rocks. The headland where St. Morwenna's stands juts out into the sea like a ship's prow. From here, on a clear day, you can see for miles in every direction. North across the Bristol Channel toward Wales. West along the coast toward Land's End. South over the moorland, rising toward the interior. East toward the market towns, and eventually the rest of England. But on stormy days, which are common, visibility drops to yards or even feet, the world shrinking to a gray chaos of wind and rain and sea spray, the boundary between ocean and air dissolving into a wet roar that seems like it might wash everything away. The church itself is built of granite, that ubiquitous Cornish stone that ranges in color from pale gray to almost black, depending on where it was quarried. Granite is a hard stone, resistant to weathering, which is why so much of Cornwall's ancient architecture survives. But it is also a cold stone, and Cornish churches have a reputation for being chilly places even in summer. In winter, they can be brutally cold, the stone seeming to absorb and hold the chill, releasing it slowly into the air so that breath mists and fingers go numb despite gloves. St. Morwenna's follows the typical Cornish church pattern. A tower at the western end, a nave with aisles to north and south, a chancel at the eastern end where the altar stands. The tower is square and solid, built to withstand the Atlantic gales, its walls several feet thick at the base. The battlements at the top give it a fortress-like appearance, which is appropriate given that Cornish churches often serve as places of refuge during times of danger, their solid construction and elevated positions making them natural strongholds. The building dates primarily from the 15th century, though parts of it are older. There was certainly a church on this site in Norman times, possibly earlier. The location suggests it might have been a pre-Christian sacred site, as Celtic Christianity often built its churches where pagan worship had occurred, baptizing the old sacred places into the new faith. The churchyard contains graves dating back centuries, the oldest markers so weathered that their inscriptions are illegible, the names of the dead literally eroded away by wind and rain and time. Inside, the church has that particular smell that old churches have. Stone and wood and candle wax, and olden books and time itself. Somehow, as if centuries of prayers and hymns have soaked into the walls and floors and pews, becoming part of the fabric of the building. The floor is part stone, part old tiles, worn smooth by generations of feet. The pews are carved oak, dark with age and polish, each family having its traditional spot where they've sat for decades or centuries. The font near the door is Norman work. It's stone carved with simple geometric patterns that have barely softened in 800 years. The windows are mostly clear glass, as much Cornish church glass was destroyed during the Reformation and never replaced, though there are a few Victorian stained glass windows depicting biblical scenes in the somewhat sentimental style popular in that era. Light comes in cold and gray even on sunny days, filtered through the thick glass and the small window openings, giving the interior a dim, underwater quality that adds to the sense of timelessness. But it is the tower that concerns us most, and specifically what the tower contains. At the western end of the church, a door set into the thick tower wall opens onto a narrow stone spiral staircase. These stairs wind upward clockwise, the traditional direction for defensive staircases in towers, making it harder for attackers climbing the stairs to swing weapons. The steps are worn smooth in the centers from centuries of use, and they are steep and irregular, requiring care, especially in the dim light that comes from narrow slit windows. The stairs emerge into the ringing chamber, a space perhaps 15 feet square, with a ceiling about 8 feet high. The floor here is wood, heavy planks laid over stone supports, and 3 ropes hang down through holes in the ceiling. These are the bell ropes, and they are thick ropes, worn smooth by generations of hands, each ending in a colorful sally, the striped section that ringers grip when pulling. Even when the ropes are still, they seem to hold a kind of potential energy, a readiness to spring into motion and set the bells above swinging. The ringing chamber has small windows on each wall, unglazed but with wooden shutters that can be closed in bad weather. Through these windows, you can see out over the village, the harbor below, the sea stretching to the horizon. It is a place of magnificent views, but also of powerful winds that come howling through the openings, making the ropes dance and sway even when no hand touches them. Above the ringing chamber is the bell chamber itself, reached by a wooden ladder that climbs through a hatch in the ceiling. The bell chamber is larger but lower ceilinged, and here the bells themselves hang. 3 bronze bells, each mounted on a wooden headstock that in turn is mounted on an iron axle that allows the bell to swing. The oldest bell, cast in 1523 during the reign of Henry VIII, bears a Latin inscription that translates as, "I call the living, I mourn the dead, I break the lightning." It weighs approximately 500 weight, around 250 kilograms, and it is called the treble, the highest pitched of the 3. The middle bell dates from 1652, cast during the Commonwealth period after the English Civil War. Its inscription reads peace and goodwill, a prayer no doubt heartfelt after the decades of conflict that had torn England apart. This bell weighs 600 weight and produces a deeper, richer tone than the treble. The largest bell, the tenor, was cast in 1781 during the reign of George III. It bears the inscription, "I ring for joy, I toll for sorrow," which nicely encapsulates the dual role of church bells, celebrating marriages and victories, mourning deaths and defeats. The tenor weighs 800 weight, over 400 kilograms, and its voice is deep and sonorous, carrying for miles across the moors and over the sea when it is rung properly. Each bell is mounted so that it can swing through nearly 360 degrees, though for normal ringing they swing back and forth through about 180 degrees. At the top of the swing, a wooden stay attached to the headstock catches against the slider, holding the bell in the up position until the ringer pulls the rope and releases it. This arrangement allows for the precise control needed for change ringing, the distinctly English art of ringing bells in mathematical patterns, creating sequences that can last for hours without repetition. The bell chamber is dark and dusty, filled with the smell of old wood and metal and bird droppings, as birds sometimes nest in the louvers. The space is dominated by the bells themselves, these massive bronze objects that seem almost alive, waiting to speak. Touch a bell, and it resonates faintly, as if remembering its voice. Stand close when one is ringing, and the sound is overwhelming, not just heard but felt, vibrating through your bones and organs, the very air seeming to solidify with sound. This, then, is the setting. A granite church on a headland, a tower holding 3 ancient bells, a village of fisher folk and farmers living their lives in the shadow of both church and sea, a time when the old certainties are beginning to crack and the modern world is not quite born. It is a place ripe for mystery, a time open to the unexplained. And into this place, at this time, something began to happen that would puzzle investigators and intrigue believers for over a century to come. Part 2. The Vicar and his Parish. To understand what happened at St. Morwenna's in the spring and summer of 1887, we must first understand the man at the center of the story, Reverend Thomas Penglace. He was 53 years old that year, a tall, lean man with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that comes from living in a place where wind and salt spray are constants. He had been vicar of St. Morwenna's for nearly 20 years, appointed in 1868 when he was in his early 30s, and he had grown to love the place and its people with a depth that surprised him. Penglace was Cornish by birth, born and raised in Truro, the county's cathedral town. This was somewhat unusual, as many rural Cornish livings went to English clergy who regarded them as exile postings, remote places to serve time before moving on to better appointments. But Penglace had never wanted to leave Cornwall. He had studied at Cambridge, reading theology at Corpus Christi College, and while he appreciated the ancient university and its traditions, he had always felt like an outsider there. A Cornish man among Englishmen, his accent marking him as provincial, his background as less prestigious than the public school boys who dominated the college. He had returned to Cornwall as soon as his studies were complete and taken a curacy in a parish on the south coast. When a living at St. Morwenna's became available, he applied immediately, attracted by the remoteness and the beauty of the north coast. The appointment was in the gift of the local landowner, a baronet whose family had owned much of the surrounding land for generations, and the baronet, being Cornish himself, preferred to appoint a local man who would understand the people and their ways. Penglace proved to be an excellent choice. He was neither too high church nor too low, maintaining the traditional prayer book services but without excessive ceremony, which suited the pragmatic Cornish temperament. He preached well, but briefly, understanding that his parishioners were working people who needed to get home to their labors. He visited the sick, buried the dead, baptized the babies, and married the young couples. He involved himself in parish affairs, serving on the school board, supporting the lifeboat fund, mediating disputes when needed. But he was also a scholar at heart. His house, the vicarage that stood next to the church, contained a library of several hundred books, and he spent many hours among them, reading not just theology but history, natural philosophy, poetry, the classics. He had a particular interest in local history and had become something of an expert on the history of his own parish, studying old records, transcribing ancient documents, collecting stories from elderly parishioners about the old days. He kept detailed journals, recording not just the official business of baptisms and burials, but also observations about the weather, the farming, the fishing, unusual events, interesting conversations, creating a rich record of parish life that would prove invaluable to later historians. He was a bachelor, which was less common among Anglican clergy than it had been in earlier centuries, when celibacy was more highly valued. His housekeeper, Mrs. Yago, a widow from the village, kept house for him, cooking his meals and managing the domestic side of the vicarage while he attended to his clerical duties and his studies. Theirs was a comfortable arrangement, and the parish had long since given up trying to marry him off to one of the local daughters. He seemed content with his books and his work, and if he was lonely sometimes, he kept it to himself. Penglay's faith was genuine, but not simple. He had wrestled with doubt, as any thinking person must, and had emerged with a religion that was both intellectual and emotional, both rational and mystical. He believed in God, in the resurrection of Christ, in the basic tenets of Christianity as taught by the Anglican Church. But he also believed that the world contained mysteries that theology could not fully explain, that there were more things in heaven and earth than were dreamt of in the philosophy of any single system of thought. He had grown up with the Cornish folk beliefs, the stories of piskies and knockers, of ghost ships and phantom bells, and while his education had taught him to regard these as superstitions, remnants of pre-Christian paganism that should be gently discouraged, he could not quite dismiss them entirely. He had heard too many stories from too many sensible people, had experienced too many things himself that defied easy explanation. He tried to maintain a position of educated skepticism, neither believing nor disbelieving, simply remaining open to the possibility that the world was stranger than official religion or official science allowed. This intellectual and spiritual flexibility would serve him well in the events to come, allowing him to observe and record carefully without immediately dismissing what he witnessed or leaping to supernatural explanations. He would approach the mystery of the ringing bell as both priest and scientist, as believer and doubter, recording what he saw with care and honesty even when he could not explain it. The parish he served contained approximately 200 souls, spread across several small settlements and isolated farms. The largest concentration was in the village that clustered around the harbor, perhaps 30 cottages housing fishing families. Then there were several small farmsteads on the slopes above the coast, growing potatoes and oats in the thin soil, keeping sheep and a few cattle on the rougher land, eking out a modest living from agriculture supplemented by fishing in season. The people were poor by any objective standard, their lives hard and uncertain, but they had a dignity and independence that Penglace admired. They did not complain about their lot, did not expect charity, worked from dawn to dusk without complaint. They helped each other in times of trouble, gathering to launch the lifeboat when needed, contributing what they could when a family faced hardship, maintaining a network of mutual support that was more reliable than any government assistance. They were also, for the most part, good Christians in a practical sort of way. They attended church on Sundays when weather and work allowed. They brought their children for baptism, married in the church, were buried in the churchyard. They said their prayers and believed in heaven, though their concept of the afterlife was influenced as much by Celtic tradition as by Anglican theology, involving thin places where the dead could communicate with the living, where on certain nights of the year the boundary between worlds grew permeable. Among the leading families of the parish were the Tregears, who had been fishing from this harbor for as long as anyone could remember. William Tregear, the patriarch in 1887, was 60 years old, a weather-beaten man with hands like gnarled roots and eyes that could read the sea like a book. He was also the chief bell ringer, having learned the art from his father and grandfather before him. Under his leadership, St. Morwenna's had a competent team of 6 ringers who could ring the bells for services and special occasions with skill and precision. William took his role seriously. The bells, he believed, were sacred trusts, instruments of worship that required respect and proper handling. He ensured the bells and their fittings were maintained in good condition, the ropes replaced when they wore, the mechanisms oiled and adjusted as needed. He taught younger men the art of ringing, passing on techniques and traditions that went back generations. On Sunday mornings, the bells of St. Morwenna's rang out clear and true, calling the faithful to worship, and this was largely due to William's dedication. There was also the Nancaro family, farmers who worked land on the slopes above the village. John Nancaro, the current holder of the farm, was a thoughtful, quiet man in his 30s, married with 4 children. He served as church warden, one of the 2 laymen responsible for the practical affairs of the church building and its grounds. It was a position of responsibility and respect, and John took it seriously, overseeing repairs to the building, managing the churchyard, ensuring candles and communion wine were available, handling the practical details that allowed Reverend Penglace to focus on the spiritual side of his ministry. Then there were the Pascoes, an ancient family in the parish with a reputation for second sight. Mrs. Elizabeth Pascoe, an elderly woman in 1887, was regarded with a mixture of respect and slight unease by her neighbors. She was known to have dreams that came true, to sense when death was approaching, to see things that others did not see. The church officially discouraged such beliefs, regarding them as superstition, but Mrs. Pascoe was a faithful churchgoer, and Penglace had learned to respect her insights even when they came from sources outside Orthodox Christianity. These and others made up the community of St. Morwenna's parish, a small community bound together by geography, kinship, shared labor, and shared faith. They were people of the land and sea, practical folk who did not have time for frivolity, but who maintained deep traditions and beliefs that connected them to the past and to each other. Into this stable, traditional community, the events of spring 1887 would arrive like a stone thrown into a still pond, creating ripples that would spread outward and persist for generations. The winter of 1886 to 1887 had been harsh. Storm after storm had rolled in from the Atlantic, bringing rain, wind, and mountainous seas that kept the fishing boats in harbor for days at a time. Several cottages had lost roof tiles. A wall of the churchyard had partially collapsed and needed rebuilding. The lanes had turned to mud, making travel difficult. Everyone was weary of winter, longing for spring and the easing of the weather's fury. By March, there were signs that spring was approaching. Days were growing longer, the sun climbing higher in the sky. Primroses appeared in sheltered spots. Seabirds returned to the cliffs to nest. But March is a treacherous month on the north coast of Cornwall, capable of sudden storms, of days that start mild and end with gales, of weather that can change in minutes from benign to dangerous. Old sailors knew to respect March, to watch the sky, to read the signs that nature provided. On the evening of March 14th, 1887, such a storm was building. The day had been relatively calm, but by afternoon the wind was rising from the southwest, that direction that brings the fiercest weather to this coast. Clouds were building, dark and heavy, and the sea was beginning to show white caps even in the harbor. The fishing boats had come in early, and their crews had secured them carefully, knowing what was coming. By evening, The storm had arrived in force. Reverend Penglace had been working in his study, preparing his sermon for the coming Sunday. His text was from the Gospel of John. "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you." He was trying to craft words that would speak to his parishioners about finding peace amid life storms, both literal and metaphorical, about trusting in God's providence even when circumstances were difficult. It was a theme appropriate to the season and to the lives of his flock, who faced danger and uncertainty as constant companions. The wind was rattling the windows of the vicarage, and rain was starting to lash against the glass. A fire burned in the grate, but the room was still drafty, and Penglace had wrapped himself in a shawl to ward off the chill. He was deep in concentration, struggling with a particular passage, when he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind. Wind can make many sounds as it howls around buildings, and old houses are full of creaks and groans. But then it came again, unmistakable. The deep, sonorous tone of a bell. The tenor bell, to be specific, that largest of the 3 bells in the tower. One toll, then silence. Then another toll. Penglace set down his pen and listened intently. The storm was loud, wind shrieking around the eaves, rain hammering on the roof, but through it all came that measured tolling. One toll every 5 seconds or so. The pace of a funeral knell, the traditional way to ring when announcing a death. But this made no sense. No one had died that he knew of, and even if someone had, who would be ringing the bell on a night like this? He stood, his chair scraping on the floor, and went to the window. From here, he could see the church tower, dark against the stormy sky. As he watched, he saw it, the faint swing of the bell visible through the louvered openings, the bronze catching a glint of light from somewhere. The bell was definitely moving, swinging back and forth in its mounting, producing that slow, regular toll. But the church was locked. He had locked it himself after evensong, the evening service, some 3 hours earlier. The keys were here in the vicarage. No one could be in the tower ringing the bell because no one could have gotten in. Yet the bell was ringing. For a long moment, Penglace stood frozen at the window, his mind racing through possibilities. A prank? But who would break into a church during a storm to ring a bell? And how would they get in? A mechanical failure? But bells don't ring themselves due to mechanical failure. They either ring wildly or not at all. The wind? But the bell chamber was designed to prevent wind from setting the bell swinging. And besides, this was controlled ringing, not random clanging. He made a decision. He needed to investigate. He pulled on his heavy coat, jammed his hat on his head, and took the large ring of church keys from their hook by the door. Mrs. Yago heard him moving about and called out to ask if everything was all right. "I need to check the church," he called back. "I'll return shortly." He took a lantern, lit it, and stepped out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet. The rain was coming almost horizontally, driven by the gale, instantly soaking his coat despite its thickness. The 50 yards from vicarage to church felt like a mile. He hunched forward, lantern held low to keep it from being blown out, and pushed through the storm. The bell was still tolling, that slow, measured pace, audible even over the shriek of the wind. He reached the church door, fumbled with the keys, his fingers already numb with cold. The lock was stiff, but he got the key turned and pushed the heavy door open. Inside, the church was dark and silent except for the muffled roar of the storm outside. He raised his lantern, casting flickering light across the pews, the pillars, the shadowed spaces of the nave. Empty. No one there. Yet as he stood, dripping onto the stone floor, he heard it again, the toll of the bell, coming from above, from the tower. He walked down the nave to the tower door at the western end. This door was also locked. He unlocked it with a hand that was now trembling, though whether from cold or something else he could not say. Beyond was the spiral staircase, dark and narrow, the steps rising into blackness. He began to climb, his lantern throwing wild shadows on the stone walls. The ringing chamber was empty. The 3 bell ropes hung down through their holes in the ceiling, swaying slightly, but not moving in the manner they would if someone were ringing. Yet above, in the bell chamber, he could hear the creak and groan of moving wood, the deep, resonant hum of the tenor bell as it swung. The sound was coming from directly overhead. Penglace stood in the ringing chamber, his heart pounding. He had to go up. He had to see. He set his lantern on the floor and climbed the wooden ladder to the hatch that led into the bell chamber. He pushed the hatch open and climbed through. The bell chamber was dark, the small amount of light from his lantern below barely reaching this high. But he could see the tenor bell, or rather its dark mass against the slightly less dark stone wall, and he could see that it was moving, swinging back and forth, not the full wild swing of proper ringing, but a gentler oscillation, perhaps 30 degrees to either side, just enough to make the clapper strike the bell and produce that measured toll. He watched, transfixed. There was no one else in the chamber. The bell was simply swinging, as if invisible hands were moving it. The mechanism looked normal, no signs of damage or malfunction. The stay and slider that should have held the bell at rest were in place, but somehow the bell had been set moving and now continued to swing. He felt a cold that had nothing to do with the storm outside, a chill that seemed to come from within the bell chamber itself, or perhaps from within himself, as if his blood had suddenly turned to ice. He had heard stories of haunted churches, of bells that rang for the dead, of supernatural phenomena. He had always maintained a scholarly distance from such tales, neither believing nor disbelieving. But now he was confronted with something that his rational mind could not explain. The bell continued its measured swinging for perhaps 5 more minutes while Penglace watched. Then, gradually, the swings grew smaller. The tolling grew quieter. Finally, the bell came to rest, hanging still and silent in its mounting. Whatever force had set it moving was spent. Penglace descended the ladder on shaking legs. He retrieved his lantern and made his way back down the spiral staircase, through the church, out into the storm. He locked the church behind him and returned to the vicarage, where he immediately went to his study, sat at his desk, and began to write. His journal entry for that night, preserved now in the Cornwall County Archives, reads in part, "On this night of March 14th, 1887, I witnessed something I cannot account for by any natural philosophy known to me. The tenor bell rang at approximately 9:15 p.m. and continued for perhaps 15 minutes. Upon investigation, I found no living person in the church or tower. The bell was observed by me to be swinging in its mounting with no visible cause. The weather was stormy, wind from the southwest, heavy rain. The bell chamber was secure, showing no signs of entry or tampering. I record this event precisely as witnessed, without interpretation, and commit the mystery to Providence." He sat for a long time after writing this, staring at the words, wondering what they meant. Finally, he extinguished his lamp and went to bed, but he did not sleep well. The sound of the bell kept echoing in his mind, that slow, measured toll, like a voice speaking from somewhere beyond the veil that separates the living from the dead, the known from the unknown. And this was only the beginning. Part 3. Witnesses and Investigations. The next morning dawned gray and damp, the storm having blown itself out during the night, leaving behind broken branches, puddles, and a sea still churning in gray. Reverend Penglace rose early, having slept fitfully, his mind troubled by what he had witnessed. He dressed, ate a breakfast he barely tasted, and walked to the church to examine it by daylight. Everything appeared normal. The church was locked as he had left it. Inside, nothing was disturbed. He climbed once again to the bell chamber and examined the tenor bell carefully. It hung perfectly still, its mechanism showing no signs of unusual wear or stress. The stay was intact, the slider functional, the mounting solid. There was no rational explanation for what he had witnessed, yet he knew he had witnessed it. He was not given to flights of fancy or imaginative exaggeration. What he had seen was real. He decided to say nothing for the moment. Perhaps it had been a singular event, inexplicable but isolated, something to puzzle over but not to alarm his parishioners unnecessarily. He went about his day's work, visiting a sick parishioner, working on his sermon, conducting the normal business of a country vicar. But that evening, as he was sitting down to his supper, there came a knock at the vicarage door. Mrs. Yago answered it and showed in William Tregear, the chief bell ringer, accompanied by his son Thomas. They looked troubled. "Begging your pardon, Reverend," William said, twisting his cap in his hands, "but we heard the bell last night, the tenor, ringing during the storm. My wife heard it, and so did Thomas here, and several others in the village. We've come to ask if everything is all right with the church, if perhaps something's amiss with the bell." Panglace felt his stomach tighten. So others had heard it too. This wasn't his imagination or a trick of the storm. "Please sit down," he said, gesturing to chairs. "Tell me exactly what you heard." William and Thomas sat, clearly uncomfortable being in the vicarage parlor, but determined to speak their minds. It was about 9 o'clock or shortly after, William said. The storm was fierce, and we were all indoors. My wife heard it first, said the bell was ringing. I thought she was mistaken, thought it was just the wind playing tricks. But then I heard it too, clear as anything. The tenor, ringing slow like for a death knell. It rang for maybe 10 minutes or more, then stopped. I heard it too, Thomas added. And so did the Nancaros and old Mrs. Pascoe and several others. There's talk in the village this morning. People are asking why the bell was rung during the storm, if someone's died and we haven't heard yet. Panglace made a decision. These were sensible men, and they deserved honesty. I heard it too, he said. In fact, I went to the church to investigate. The church was locked as I had left it. I unlocked it and climbed to the tower. There was no one there. Yet the tenor bell was swinging, as if being rung, though no hand touched it. The two men stared at him. William's face had gone pale. "No one there," he said slowly. "But that's not possible. Bells don't ring themselves." "I would have said the same thing yesterday," Panglace replied. "Yet I saw what I saw. I'm as puzzled as you are." Thomas crossed himself, an instinctive gesture. "Begging your pardon, Reverend, but there are old stories about bells ringing by themselves. For the dead, mostly. For souls lost at sea." His father shot him a sharp look, but Thomas continued. "My grandmother used to tell about the bells of Lyonesse, ringing under the waves. And there's churches where the bells toll when someone's about to die, toll before anyone knows there's been a death. If St. Morwenna's bell is ringing, maybe it's trying to tell us something." "That's old superstition," William said firmly, though his voice lacked conviction. "There's got to be a natural explanation. Maybe the wind, or the way the storm affected the mechanisms." "Perhaps," Panglace said carefully. "I'd like you to examine the bells thoroughly, William, when you have time. Look for anything that might explain this. Any mechanical fault, any way the wind could have set the bell moving." William nodded, relieved to have something practical to do. "I'll do that, Reverend. Right away, if you'd like." The three men walked to the church together. Panglace unlocked the doors, and they climbed to the bell chamber, where William conducted a meticulous examination. He checked every part of the mechanism, the wooden headstock, the metal bearings, the stay and slider, the mounting in the stone. He tested how easily the bell moved, whether there were any rough spots that might cause it to swing on its own. He examined the louvered openings to see if wind could somehow have gotten in with enough force to move the bell. After nearly an hour of investigation, William shook his head. "I can find nothing wrong, Reverend. The bell is in good condition, well maintained. The mounting is solid. And I'll tell you this, that bell won't move on its own. Even in the fiercest wind, with air coming through those louvers, it wouldn't be enough to set a bell this size swinging. It would take a strong man pulling on the rope, or someone up here physically pushing the bell to get it started." "Yet it was moving," Panglace said quietly. "I saw it with my own eyes." William nodded slowly, his weathered face troubled. "Aye, Reverend, and that's what worries me. Because if there's no natural explanation..." He trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought. They descended from the tower in silence. William and Thomas took their leave, and Panglace returned to the vicarage, his mind churning. He spent the evening reading, searching through his library for any accounts of similar phenomena. He found several. Bells ringing without human agency were not unknown in the historical record. There were accounts from medieval times, from the Renaissance, even from recent Victorian England. Churches across Britain and Europe had experienced such events, and while skeptics always dismissed them as hoaxes or misunderstandings, the accounts persisted. The next few days passed quietly. Panglace went about his duties, conducted services, visited parishioners. The bell did not ring again, and gradually the incident began to fade from immediate concern. People still talked about it, but life went on. The fishing boats went out when the weather allowed. The farmers tended their fields. Children went to school. The rhythm of village life continued. Then came the night of March 22nd, 8 days after the first incident. Another storm was building, though not as fierce as the first. Panglace was in his study, as was his habit in the evenings, when he heard it again. The tenor bell, that same measured tolling, carrying through the sound of wind and rain. His heart sank. It was happening again. This time, he did not go to investigate immediately. He went instead to the window and looked toward the village. Lamplight shone from cottage windows, and as he watched, he saw doors opening, figures emerging, looking toward the church. Others were hearing it too. This was not his imagination, not a private experience. Whatever was happening, it was real and observable by anyone within hearing range. He put on his coat and walked to the church, but by the time he arrived, a small crowd had gathered. William Tregear was there, and John Nancuro, and several other men from the village. They stood in the churchyard, looking up at the tower, listening to the bell. "Reverend," John said as Panglace approached, "it's happening again. The bell's ringing, and there's no one in the tower. We've checked the door, it's locked tight." "I'll open it," Panglace said. "Anyone who wishes may come with me to witness this." A dozen men followed him into the church and up into the tower. Once again, the ringing chamber was empty, the ropes hanging still. Once again, the tenor bell was swinging in the chamber above, producing that measured toll. The men crowded onto the ladder, peering up into the bell chamber, and one by one they saw what Panglace had seen, the bell moving with no visible cause. They stood in silence, watching until the bell gradually slowed and came to rest. Then they descended, and in the body of the church, Reverend Panglace led them in prayer, asking for protection, for understanding, for God's guidance in the face of mystery. It was all he knew to do. The next morning, word came that changed everything. A fishing boat had been lost in the night storm. The Sea Maid, a small vessel with a crew of 3, had failed to return to port. Wreckage had been spotted at first light, floating in the cove. Through the day, the bodies washed ashore one by one. 3 men, all from the parish, all with families, all drowned in the cold Atlantic waters. The coincidence, if it was a coincidence, sent a shock wave through the community. The bell had rung, and then men had died. In the traditions of Cornwall, bells sometimes rang for the dead before the dead were known. It was an old belief, one that rational Victorian minds tried to dismiss, but it was deeply rooted nonetheless. And now it seemed to have happened at St. Morwenna's. The funerals were held 3 days later, all 3 men buried in the churchyard in a single solemn service. The church was packed, standing room only, as the entire parish turned out to mourn. Reverend Penglace conducted the service with a heavy heart, speaking words of comfort and hope to the widows and orphans, committing the bodies to the earth and the souls to God's mercy. The bells were rung properly by living ringers, following the traditional patterns for the dead, the sound carrying across the parish as a lament. In the days following the funeral, Penglace found himself besieged with questions and theories. Some parishioners were frightened, believing the church was haunted, that something evil or at least uncanny had taken up residence in the tower. Others were awed, seeing the bell as a sign, a message from the other side, proof that there was more to existence than the visible world. Still others sought rational explanations, insisting there must be some mechanical or natural cause that simply hadn't been discovered yet. Mrs. Pascoe, the elderly woman with a reputation for second sight, came to the vicarage to speak with Penglace privately. "Reverend," she said in her quavering voice, "my grandmother told me about the bells ringing in the old days. During the great storm of 1703, the bells rang by themselves, rang for days, calling the lost souls home. 7 sailors were buried here after that storm, strangers whose names were never known. Maybe the bell remembers. Maybe it's trying to tell us something." This was the first Penglace had heard of any connection to 1703, and his scholarly instincts were immediately aroused. "Tell me more," he said. "What exactly did your grandmother say?" Mrs. Pascoe settled into her chair, her old eyes distant as she reached back into memory. She was just a girl in 1703, maybe 7 or 8 years old. She remembered the storm, said it was the worst anyone had ever seen. The wind howled for a week, and the sea came up higher than anyone thought possible. Ships were wrecked all along the coast. Bodies washed up for weeks after. She said the church bells rang during the storm, all 3 of them, ringing wild like the wind itself was pulling them. Everyone was too frightened to go near the church. After the storm passed, bodies started coming ashore. Some were local men, fishers who'd been caught out. But others were strangers, sailors from a big ship that went down somewhere offshore. 7 of them washed up here, and they were buried in the churchyard. No one knew their names or where they'd come from. After those burials, the bells stopped ringing. My grandmother, said the vicar at the time, was too afraid to ring them for services for nearly a month. We finally had them rung again. Everything was normal. But she always remembered it, always said the bells had been calling the dead home. Penglace listened intently. If this account was true, it might provide a crucial piece of the puzzle. He thanked Mrs. Pascoe for sharing the story, and as soon as she left, he went to his study and pulled out the old parish registers. These thick volumes contain the official records of the church going back to the 16th century. He found a volume covering 1703 and began to read. The entries were in an old-fashioned hand, difficult to parse, but he worked through them systematically. And there it was, in late October 1703, a series of burial entries. October 28th. Buried unknown man, recovered from the sea. October 28th. Buried unknown man, recovered from the sea. 7 entries in total, all on the same day or the days immediately following. all recording the burial of unidentified men recovered from the sea. The vicar who made these entries had added a note. These were sailors from a merchant vessel wrecked in the great storm. No names could be determined. May God have mercy on their souls. Penglace sat back, his mind racing. Here was tangible confirmation of Mrs. Pascoe's story. 7 unknown sailors, buried in his churchyard nearly 200 years ago. Could there be a connection to the present events? It seemed far-fetched, yet Mrs. Pascoe had specifically mentioned 7 sailors before he had found this record. How had she known the exact number if it wasn't true? He decided to search for more information about the Great Storm of 1703. His library contained several volumes on British history, and he found references to what was indeed called the Great Storm, one of the worst natural disasters to strike the British Isles. It had occurred in late November 1703. The dating in Mrs. Pascoe's account had been slightly off, lasting nearly a week. Thousands of people had died. Hundreds of ships had been wrecked. Whole towns had been destroyed. One account estimated that over 8,000 sailors had drowned in that storm. In the days following this research, Penglace wrote to several scholarly societies and to colleagues at Cambridge, describing the phenomena and inquiring whether they had knowledge of similar events. The responses, when they came, were mixed. Most were polite but dismissive, suggesting he was being taken in by local superstition or that there must be a natural explanation he had overlooked. But a few were more interesting. One correspondent, a clergyman in Yorkshire, wrote that his church had experienced similar phenomena, and that investigation had revealed the church to be built on an ancient burial ground. Another, a scholar of folklore, sent a lengthy letter detailing accounts of self-ringing bells from across Europe, noting that they were almost always associated with places of death or tragedy. Meanwhile, the bell itself continued to ring intermittently. Not every night, but often enough that the pattern became clear. It rang most frequently during stormy weather, always at night, always that same measured tolling. Sometimes Penglace investigated, sometimes he did not. Sometimes other villagers went to the church to listen. The phenomenon became a strange new normal, something the parish learned to live with. William Tregear made repeated examinations of the bells and mechanisms, trying to find some physical explanation. He consulted with other bell ringers from neighboring parishes, with craftsmen who worked with metal and wood. No one could find a flaw or fault. The bells were in perfect working order, yet they rang. One evening in early April, Penglace was visited by a gentleman from Plymouth, a Mr. Edmund Harrow, who introduced himself as a member of the Society for Psychical Research. He had heard accounts of the ringing bell and wished to investigate. Penglace was initially skeptical, worried that Mr. Harrow might be a sensationalist or a fraud, but the man proved to be serious and methodical. He asked for permission to spend several nights in the church, observing and taking measurements, and Penglace, curious to see what a trained investigator might discover, agreed. Mr. Harrow arrived with an array of equipment: thermometers, barometers, notebooks, a pocket watch for precise time measurements. He set up in the ringing chamber and waited. On his third night, the bell rang. Harrow made careful notes of the time, the weather conditions, the temperature, the atmospheric pressure. He climbed to the bell chamber and observed the swinging bell, making sketches and measurements. He found nothing that his instruments could detect as unusual except for the obvious fact that the bell was moving with no visible cause. His report, which he shared with Penglace before leaving, concluded that the phenomenon was genuine but inexplicable by current scientific understanding. He hypothesized that there might be some form of electromagnetic or vibrational effect at work, something related to the geology of the site or the atmospheric conditions during storms, but he could not prove this. The bells remained a mystery. As spring progressed into summer, the ringing became less frequent. By June, it had stopped entirely. The village relaxed, and life returned to its normal rhythms. Pinglace continued his research, compiling all his observations into a lengthy manuscript that he titled An Account of Unusual Occurrences at St. Morwenna's Parish Church. He sent copies to various institutions and scholars, hoping someone might provide insight. But in his heart, he knew the truth. Some mysteries resist explanation. Some phenomena exist at the boundaries of human understanding, neither provable nor disprovable, real yet inexplicable. The bell of St. Morwenna's was such a mystery. It had rung, it would ring again, and the world would simply have to accept that not everything can be reduced to neat scientific laws or theological doctrines. The story would continue through the decades and into the next century, but that summer of 1887, as the bell fell silent and the parish returned to normal, Reverend Thomas Pinglace sat in his study and wrote in his journal. Perhaps some things are not meant to be understood, but simply witnessed. Perhaps the mystery itself is the message, reminding us that we do not know as much as we think we know, that the world contains depths we have not fathomed and never will. I commit this mystery to God and to time, trusting that someday, if understanding is meant to come, it will come. Until then, I will continue my work, serve my people, and listen when the bell calls, knowing that it speaks in a language older than words, about matters deeper than thought. Part 4. The Carved Message and the Lost Souls. As summer gave way to autumn in 1887, Reverend Pinglace found himself unable to let the mystery rest completely. The academic in him needed to understand, to find patterns, to uncover connections. He spent countless hours in the church, not just conducting services and fulfilling his priestly duties, but examining every inch of the building, searching for clues that might illuminate what was happening. It was during one of these investigations in early October that John Nankuro, the church warden, made a discovery that would add another layer to the mystery. John had been supervising some minor repairs to the bell chamber, a routine maintenance task that involved replacing some weathered wood and checking the structural integrity of the tower. While working on one of the main support beams, he noticed something that had been obscured by centuries of dust and candle soot. Carved markings on the ancient oak. He called down to Pinglace, who was in the ringing chamber below. "Reverend, you should see this. There's writing up here, carved into the beam." Pinglace climbed up immediately, his curiosity aroused. By the light of their lanterns, they could make out letters and numbers carved deeply into the wood. John carefully cleaned the surface with a soft cloth, revealing the full inscription. It read, 1703, remember the lost. The date was unmistakable. 1703, the year of the great storm, the year 7 unknown sailors were buried in the churchyard. And beneath it, those haunting words, remember the lost. Pinglace felt his pulse quicken. Here was a tangible connection between the present phenomena and that terrible storm of nearly 2 centuries past. Someone, presumably the vicar of 1703 or perhaps one of the bell ringers, had carved this message into the beam. But what did it mean? Was it simply a memorial, a reminder to pray for the unknown dead? Or is it something more? Over the following days, Pinglace intensified his research into the events of 1703. He traveled to Truro to examine documents in the county archive, reading old newspapers and maritime records. He wrote to historians and maritime experts, seeking information about ships lost in the Great Storm. And slowly, a fuller picture began to emerge. The Great Storm of 1703 had struck in late November, beginning on November 24th and lasting for nearly a week. It was, by all accounts, the worst storm to hit the British Isles in recorded history. Wind speeds were estimated to have exceeded 100 miles per hour. Barometers dropped to levels never seen before or since. The damage was catastrophic. In London alone, 2,000 chimney stacks collapsed. The Eddystone Lighthouse, one of the marvels of engineering at the time, was completely destroyed, with its designer Henry Winstanley and 5 other men killed. Across the country, an estimated 8,000 people died. At sea, the destruction was even worse. The Royal Navy lost 13 ships and over 1,500 men. Merchant vessels were wrecked by the hundreds. The Channel Fleet, anchored in the Downs off the Kent coast, was devastated, with ships dragged from their moorings and smashed against each other or driven onto shore. Bodies washed up along the entire southern and western coasts of England for weeks after the storm passed. Among the ships lost was a merchant vessel called the Prospect, according to a record Penglace found in the Maritime Archives. The Prospect had been sailing from Bristol to London with a cargo of wool and tin when the storm struck. The ship was driven westward by the fierce winds, off course and out of control. Somewhere off the north coast of Cornwall, it had broken up and all hands were lost. The crew was listed as 34 men, though the record noted that this number might not be exact, as merchant ships often carried additional hands who were not officially recorded. Could the Prospect be the ship whose sailors were buried at St. Morwenus? Penglace could not prove it conclusively, but the timing and location fit. The storm had struck in late November 1703. The burial entries in the parish register were dated late October, but Penglace realized this was likely an error in the old calendar system. England did not adopt the Gregorian calendar until 1752, and dates in records from before that time could be confusing. What was recorded as late October in the parish register might actually have corresponded to early November by modern reckoning, which would fit with the storm's timing. But even if he could identify the ship, what did this tell him about the present phenomena? Why would the bell ring now, nearly 200 years later, for men long dead and buried? Penglace struggled with this question. He was not comfortable with the idea of ghosts in the conventional sense. His theological training taught him that the dead either went to heaven or hell, not that they lingered on earth ringing church bells. Yet something was clearly happening, something that seemed connected to these long-ago deaths. He decided to examine the graves themselves. The 7 sailors had been buried in the churchyard, according to the records, but the exact location was not specified. Penglace walked the churchyard carefully, examining every gravestone, every marker. Most were clearly identifiable, family plots that had been used for generations, with names and dates carved into the weathered stones. But in the oldest section of the churchyard on the north side of the church, he found an area where several graves had no markers at all, just depressions in the earth where the ground had settled over buried coffins. He counted 7 such unmarked graves, arranged in 2 short rows. Could these be the burial places of the unknown sailors? It seemed likely. In 1703, it would have been standard practice to bury unidentified bodies in unmarked graves, as gravestones were expensive and generally paid for by families. Strangers with no family to claim them will be buried with simple rites and no permanent marker. Penglace stood in the churchyard on a gray November day, looking at those sunken patches of earth, and felt a profound sadness. These men, whoever they had been, had died far from home, drowned in a terrifying storm, washed up on a foreign shore, and buried in unconsecrated anonymity. No one knew their names. No one knew if they had wives or children or parents who had waited in vain for them to return. They had simply vanished from the world, leaving no trace except a few lines in a parish register and 7 unmarked graves. "Remember the lost," the carved message had said. Perhaps that was the key. Perhaps the bell was ringing as a kind of memorial, a voice speaking for those who had no voice, keeping the memory of the forgotten alive. It was a beautiful thought in its way, though it raised as many questions as it answered. How could a bronze bell remember anything? How could it ring itself in response to some kind of historical resonance? Unless Penglace thought it wasn't the bell doing the ringing at all. Unless something else, something or someone connected to those lost sailors, was using the bell to make itself known. This was a more troubling thought, one that ventured into territory that made him uncomfortable. But he could not entirely dismiss it. He decided to hold a memorial service for the unknown sailors. If nothing else, it would be a fitting gesture, a way of honoring these forgotten men, and perhaps bringing some closure to the mystery. He announced the service to the parish, explaining about the 7 sailors buried in the churchyard and the carved message in the bell chamber. The response was positive. Many parishioners liked the idea of formally remembering these long-dead strangers. It felt right, somehow, to acknowledge them, to pray for them, to name them before God, even if their earthly names were lost. The service was held on a Sunday afternoon in mid-November, as close to the anniversary of the great storm as Penglace could determine. The entire parish turned out, filling the church. Penglace led them in prayers for the dead, reading from the Book of Common Prayer. Man that is born of woman hath but a short time to live, and is full of misery. He cometh up, and is cut down like a flower. He fleeth as it were a shadow, and never continueth in one stay. He spoke about the sailors, about how they had died doing their duty, sailing the seas that were Britain's highway and Britain's battlefield. He spoke about how death comes to all, often unexpectedly, often far from home and loved ones. He spoke about the hope of resurrection, about faith in God's mercy, about the belief that no soul is truly lost if God remembers it. After the service, the congregation processed to the churchyard, to the area where the 7 unmarked graves lay. John Nankuro and several other men had erected a simple wooden cross, large enough to mark all 7 graves, with the inscription, 7 unknown sailors, lost in the great storm of 1703. Requiescant in pace. Rest in peace. Penglace blessed the graves and the cross, and the church choir sang, Eternal Father, strong to save, the naval hymn that had been written only 20 years earlier, but had already become beloved. Eternal Father, strong to save, whose arm hath bound the restless wave, who bids the mighty ocean deep its own appointed limits keep. Oh, hear us when we cry to thee, for those in peril on the sea. As the hymn echoed across the churchyard, carried by the wind toward the sea visible in the distance, many in the congregation wept, moved by the service and by thoughts of their own loved ones lost to the ocean. Cornwall had given so many sons to the sea. Every family had losses, every generation its roll of the drowned. These 7 sailors stood for all of them, a memorial to every man who had ever gone down into the deep and not returned. After the service, as people were leaving, Mrs. Pascoe approached Penglace. The old woman had tears on her weathered cheeks. That was a good thing you did, Reverend, she said. A good and proper thing. They've been waiting a long time to be remembered. Do you think this will make a difference? Penglace asked. Do you think the bell will stop ringing now? Mrs. Pascoe shook her head slowly. I don't know, Reverend, but I think you've honored them, and that matters. Whether it changes anything, well, we'll have to wait and see. That night, there was no storm, but the sea was running high, waves crashing against the cliffs with a rhythmic boom. Penglace sat in his study, unable to settle to any task, his mind full of the day's events. Around 10 o'clock, he heard it, the tenor bell, that measured tolling, carrying through the night air. His first impulse was to go to the church, but then he stopped himself. He had been to the church many times now. He knew what he would find: an empty tower, a swinging bell, no answers. Instead, he opened his window and stood listening. The bell tolled slowly, perhaps 20 times, then fell silent. It was, he realized, almost like a response to the service, an acknowledgement. The lost sailors had been remembered, and the bell had spoken in return. Thank you, perhaps. Or perhaps simply, yes, we are here, we were real, we mattered. Over the following weeks, the bell continued to ring intermittently, but Penglace thought he detected a change in quality. It seemed less urgent somehow, more peaceful. Whether this was his imagination or a real change, he could not say. But he chose to believe that the memorial service had made a difference, that in some way he did not fully understand, the act of remembering had brought a measure of peace to whatever presence was associated with the bell. He continued his research, writing extensively about his findings. He corresponded with scholars and clergy across Britain, sharing his account and seeking similar stories. He discovered that St. Morwenna's was far from unique. Many churches had stories of bells ringing without human agency. Many of these stories were associated with maritime disasters or other mass casualty events. It seemed that places of death, places where many souls had departed suddenly and perhaps violently, were often places where the boundary between the living and the dead became permeable. One correspondent, a vicar in Norfolk, wrote about a church in his parish where the bells had rung by themselves after a great flood drowned dozens of people in the 16th century. Another, from Scotland, described a Highland church where a bell tolled every year on the anniversary of a clan battle fought nearby. Still another, from Wales, told of a church bell that rang during snowstorms, said to be calling travelers to safety after a group of pilgrims had frozen to death in a blizzard centuries earlier. These accounts, whether one believed them or not, suggested a pattern. Churches as places of prayer and burial, as thin places where the spiritual and material worlds met, seemed particularly susceptible to such phenomena. Bells as the voice of the church, as instruments that literally bridged earth and heaven with their sound, might somehow be particularly sensitive to these spiritual currents. Penglace also investigated the Penglace family history more thoroughly, following up on his suspicion that he might be connected to the vicar who had buried the sailors in 1703. The vicar's name had been William Pengelly, and through careful research of parish records and family trees, Penglace confirmed that he was indeed descended from the Pengelly line. The name had changed slightly over the generations through various marriages and inheritances, but the connection was there. He was, in a very real sense, the heir of the man who had carved that message in the bell chamber. Remember the lost. This discovery gave him a strange feeling, as if he had been chosen for this role, as if his presence at St. Morwenna's in this particular time was not entirely coincidental. He did not believe in fate in any simplistic sense, but he could not shake the feeling that there was a rightness to this, a pattern at work beyond his understanding. As 1887 drew to a close, Penglace had accumulated a substantial body of observations and research. He had documented every instance of the bell ringing, noting dates, times, weather conditions, and any other potentially relevant factors. He had researched the history of the church and the parish. He had identified the likely source of the 7 bodies buried in the churchyard. He had instituted a memorial practice that honored those forgotten sailors. And yet, for all this work, he was no closer to a definitive explanation of why the bell rang. He had theories, of course. Perhaps there was some geological or atmospheric phenomenon at work, something about the way sound waves or electromagnetic fields interacted with the church structure during certain weather conditions. Perhaps there was a psychological component, a kind of mass suggestion or shared expectation that made people hear ringing that wasn't really there. Or perhaps, as he was increasingly inclined to believe, there was something genuinely supernatural at work, something that defied naturalistic explanation, something that suggested the universe was more mysterious and more populated than modern science acknowledged. Whatever the truth, Penglace knew that his time at St. Morwenna's had been marked by something extraordinary. He had witnessed something that challenged his assumptions and deepened his sense of the mystery at the heart of existence. And in a strange way, he was grateful for it. His faith had been tested and strengthened. His compassion for the dead and the forgotten had been awakened. His sense of wonder had been renewed. As the year turned and 1888 began, the bell of St. Morwenna's continued its intermittent tolling. The parish had learned to live with it. Some remained frightened, some skeptical, some awed. But all had been touched by the mystery. All carried stories they would tell their children and grandchildren, stories about the bell that rang alone, about the lost sailors, about the thin places where the living and the dead drew close together. And in the vicarage, Reverend Thomas Penglace wrote in his journal on New Year's Eve, "As this remarkable year ends, I find myself changed by what I have witnessed. I came to this parish as a young man, confident in my understanding of how the world works. I am leaving this year, though I am not leaving the parish, as an older man, humbler and wiser, knowing that I understand very little. The bell has been my teacher, showing me the limits of reason, the depth of mystery, the importance of remembering, and the reality of realms beyond the visible. I am grateful for these lessons, costly though they have been, and I pray for the souls of the 7 sailors, and for all the lost, that they may find peace at last." Part 5. The community's response and adaptation. As 1888 progressed, the phenomenon of the ringing bell became woven into the fabric of daily life at St. Morwenna's Parish. What had begun as alarming and inexplicable gradually transformed into something the community learned to accommodate, though never entirely to accept as normal. Different people responded in different ways, and these responses revealed much about the character of the parish and its inhabitants. For some of the older parishioners, particularly those like Mrs. Pascoe who maintained strong connections to the old Cornish traditions, the bell ringing was almost welcome. It confirmed what they had always believed about the world, that it was fuller and stranger than modern rationalism allowed, that the dead were not as far away as the living liked to think, that certain places and certain objects held memories and presences that could manifest under the right circumstances. These parishioners treated the ringing bell with respect, sometimes even speaking to it or about it, as if it were a presence rather than just a phenomenon. When the bell rang, they would pause in their work, cross themselves, say a prayer for the dead. Some lit candles in the church for the 7 sailors. Others left small offerings at the gravesite, continuing an old custom that predated Christianity, showing that the old ways die hard in Cornwall. For the young people of the parish, the bell became a source of fascination and no small amount of fear. Children told each other stories about ghost sailors coming to ring the bell, about phantom ships appearing when the bell tolled, about the curse of the drowned men. These stories grew more elaborate with each telling, as children's stories do, until they bore little resemblance to the actual events but captured something of the emotional truth beneath them. Some children were too frightened to walk past the church alone after dark. Others were drawn to it, daring each other to stand in the churchyard when the bell rang, testing their courage against the supernatural. Parents had mixed feelings about this. Some tried to discourage the ghost stories, seeing them as unhealthy for young minds. Others remembered their own childhood fascination with the mysterious and the spooky and allowed their children this particular form of play, understanding that engaging with fear in a controlled way is part of growing up. Reverend Penglace, for his part, tried to maintain a balance, neither encouraging superstition nor dismissing genuine spiritual experience, teaching the children that while the world indeed contained mysteries, faith in God was the proper response to fear. Among the men of the parish, particularly the fishermen and the more practically minded farmers, there was a strong desire to find a natural explanation. These were people who dealt with the real and the tangible, who trusted their hands and their eyes, who solved problems through work and ingenuity. The idea that a bell could ring without physical cause was deeply troubling to them, not because they disbelieved in the supernatural necessarily, but because it suggested a world where physical laws could be suspended, where the reliable could become unreliable. If a bell could ring itself, what else might happen? Could the sea rise without warning? Could the earth open up? Could the solid foundations of existence simply dissolve? William Tregear, the bell ringer, became almost obsessed with finding a mechanical explanation. He spent hours in the bell chamber, examining and re-examining every component, looking for where patterns, stress fractures, anything that might explain how the bell could move on its own. He consulted with other bell ringers, with blacksmiths, with anyone who might have relevant knowledge. He tested the bells in various weather conditions, trying to reproduce the ringing through natural means. He never succeeded, but he never stopped trying either. His need to understand was bone deep, a defense against a world that was proving less predictable than he had thought. John Nancaro, the churchwarden, took a different approach. He focused on the practical management of the situation. If the bell was going to ring, whether by natural or supernatural means, then the church needed to respond appropriately. He organized a rotating watch system so that someone was always available to go to the church if the bell rang, to ensure it wasn't a fire or some other emergency. He oversaw the maintenance of the bell chamber more carefully, making sure the structure was sound even if the phenomenon itself was inexplicable. And he worked with Reverend Penglace to develop appropriate prayers and responses, creating a kind of ritual around the bell ringing that gave people something to do, some way to engage with a mystery that felt constructive rather than helpless. The women of the parish, who in the Victorian era had little formal power but substantial informal influence, became the keepers of the bell story. They talked about it as they worked together, washing clothes at the communal pump, baking bread, tending children, doing the countless tasks that filled their days. They shared their fears and their theories, their prayers and their hopes. And gradually, a kind of consensus emerged among them. The bell was not to be feared but honored. It was a voice speaking for the voiceless, a memorial for the forgotten. Whether it was rung by ghosts, or by God, or by some force no one understood, its message was clear. Remember the dead. Honor those who came before. Do not let the forgotten sink entirely into oblivion. This feminine interpretation of the bell gradually spread through the parish, softening some of the fear and adding a layer of meaning that was profoundly spiritual. The bell became associated not with hauntings in the horror story sense, but with the communion of saints, that doctrine that says the living and the dead are connected in the mystical body of Christ. When the bell rang, these women would gather their families and say prayers, not prayers for protection against evil, but prayers for the souls of all the departed, particularly those who died far from home, without the comfort of family or the last rites of the church. Meanwhile, word of the St. Morwenna's bell had spread beyond the parish. Newspapers in Cornwall picked up the story, typically treating it as either a curiosity or a hoax, depending on the editorial stance of the particular paper. The more sensationalist papers ran headlines like "Ghost Bell Terrifies Cornwall Village" or "Dead Sailors Ring Church Bell from Beyond the Grave." The more sober papers offered skeptical accounts, focusing on possible natural explanations or suggesting the whole thing was a trick being played by someone in the village. This publicity brought visitors. Some came out of genuine interest, scholars or investigators hoping to witness the phenomenon. Others came as tourists, seeking entertainment or a story to tell. Still others came as skeptics, determined to expose what they assumed was a fraud. Reverend Penglace found himself in the unexpected position of having to manage these visitors, deciding who to allow access to the church and bell chamber, who to turn away, how to balance openness with protection of the sacred space and the privacy of his parish. One particularly interesting visitor arrived in the spring of 1888. Her name was Millicent Fawcett, though she was traveling under her maiden name Garrett to avoid recognition. Mrs. Fawcett was already becoming known as a suffragist and social reformer, though her most significant work was still ahead of her. She had heard about the St. Morwenna's bell from a friend and was curious, not because she believed in ghosts, but because she was interested in how communities responded to unexplained phenomena and how such events were interpreted through gendered lenses. She spent several days in the parish, staying at the vicarage as Penglace's guest, with Mrs. Yago serving as chaperone, propriety being important in Victorian society. She interviewed parishioners, attended services, examined the church and bells, and was fortunate enough to be present one evening when the bell rang. Her account of this visit, published years later in her memoirs, is illuminating. She noted that the men of the parish, with few exceptions, focused their attention on mechanism and causation, trying to solve the mystery through analysis and investigation. The women, by contrast, focused on meaning and response, trying to understand what the phenomenon signified and how to incorporate it into their spiritual lives. Both approaches had value, Mrs. Fawcett observed, but the women's approach seemed to bring more peace, more acceptance, more ability to live with uncertainty. She also noted the class dynamics at play. The educated classes, represented by Reverend Penglace, and visiting investigators, brought frameworks from theology and science, trying to fit the phenomenon into established categories. The working classes, the fishermen and farmers and their families, brought frameworks from folk tradition and lived experience, accepting that the world contained things that defied categorization. Neither group fully understood the other, but both were trying in their own ways to make sense of something genuinely puzzling. Mrs. Fawcett's presence in the parish, though brief, had an effect. As an educated, articulate woman who took the phenomenon seriously without either credulous belief or dismissive skepticism, she modeled a kind of open-minded inquiry that influenced how some parishioners thought about the bell. She asked good questions without insisting on particular answers. She listened carefully to everyone's accounts, treating the testimony of fishermen's wives with the same respect as that of the vicar. And she wrote about the experience with honesty and nuance, neither sensationalizing nor minimizing. Another significant visitor was a photographer named James Ashton, who arrived in the summer of 1888 with his equipment, hoping to capture images of the church and perhaps, if he was very lucky, some kind of visual evidence of the phenomenon. Photography was still relatively new technology, and the idea that it might capture things invisible to the naked eye was current. Spirit photography, while largely fraudulent, had captured the public imagination. Ashton spent a week in the parish, taking photographs of the church from various angles, of the bell chamber, of the bells themselves. He used long exposures, hoping to capture something unusual. His photographs, which survive in a collection at the Royal Cornwall Museum, are hauntingly beautiful but show nothing supernatural. What they do show is the church itself in meticulous detail. The weathered stone, the ancient bells, the worn steps of the tower, the view from the bell chamber out over the sea. They are a record of a place and a time, and they remind us that whether or not ghosts exist, churches and bells and stones most certainly do, and they have their own stories independent of any supernatural interpretation. As the seasons turned through 1888, the pattern of the bell ringing became clearer. It rang most frequently during the spring and autumn, when Atlantic storms were most common. It rang almost always at night, between the hours of 8 in the evening and midnight. And it rang with that same measured toll, never wildly or randomly, always in that cadence that suggested a funeral knell or perhaps a heartbeat, slow and steady and inexorable. Reverend Penglace continued his meticulous record-keeping, noting every instance of ringing he became aware of. By the end of 1888, he had documented 43 separate occasions when the bell had rung. Analyzing these records, he found some correlations. The bell rang more often when the barometric pressure was low, suggesting a connection to storms and weather. It rang more often during the new moon than the full moon, though what this might signify he could not guess. And it rang more often on Tuesdays and Saturdays than other days of the week, a pattern so odd that he suspected it might be coincidental, a product of small sample size rather than meaningful correlation. What he could not find was any correlation to actual deaths. After the initial coincidence with the loss of the sea maid, there had been other deaths in the parish, as there always are, but they did not consistently follow the bell's ringing. Sometimes the bell rang and no one died. Sometimes people died and the bell did not ring. Whatever connection existed between the bell and death, it was not simple or predictable. By the end of 1888, the parish had largely adapted to their unusual situation. The bell was part of their lives now, as much a part of St. Morwenna's as the ancient stones or the weathered pews. Children were born and baptized, couples were married, old people died and were buried, and through it all the bell rang sometimes, a voice from somewhere beyond speaking in its bronze language about things that perhaps only the dead fully understood. Penglace wrote in his journal at Christmas 1888, 2 years have passed since the bell first rang on that stormy March night. I am no closer to understanding why it rings, but I have learned to live with not knowing. Perhaps that is the lesson here. That mystery is not always something to be solved, but sometimes something to be honored. The bell rings. We do not know why. We may never know why, but we can choose how we respond. We can respond with fear, or with curiosity, or with reverence. I choose reverence. This bell, whether moved by wind or ghost or some force beyond naming, speaks of remembrance and connection, of the thin places where heaven and earth meet. And that is a sacred thing, worthy of respect. Part 6, the wider context, Victorian spiritualism and scientific investigation. To fully understand the St. Morwenna's bell phenomenon and the responses it generated, we must place it within the broader context of late Victorian attitudes toward the supernatural and the unexplained. The 1880s were a fascinating period in British history, a time when scientific rationalism and spiritual inquiry existed in complex tension, each claiming to offer truth about the nature of reality, yet arriving at very different conclusions. The Victorian-era, particularly its latter half, saw an explosion of interest in spiritualism, the belief that the dead could communicate with the living through mediums and other paranormal means. This movement had begun in America in 1848 with the Fox sisters and their claims of communicating with spirits through rapping sounds. By the 1880s, spiritualism had spread throughout the English-speaking world and beyond, attracting millions of followers, including many educated and influential people. Among the notable believers were scientists like Alfred Russel Wallace, co-discoverer with Darwin of the theory of evolution through natural selection, who became convinced that spiritualist phenomena were real and represented scientific evidence for life after death. There was Sir William Crookes, a chemist and physicist of considerable reputation, who conducted experiments with mediums and became persuaded that at least some supernatural phenomena were genuine. Even Arthur Conan Doyle, though not yet famous in the 1880s, would later become one of spiritualism's most ardent and public defenders. The appeal of spiritualism was complex. On one level, it offered comfort to a society dealing with death on a massive scale. Victorian mortality rates were high by modern standards. Child death was common. Infectious diseases could strike suddenly. Medical science could do little for many conditions. Almost every family had experienced loss, and the promise that loved ones were not truly gone but could be contacted from beyond the grave was powerfully attractive. But spiritualism also appealed to something else, a desire to reconcile science and religion, to find empirical evidence for spiritual realities. The Victorian age was one of tremendous scientific progress. Darwin's theory of evolution, published in 1859, had shaken traditional religious certainties. Geology was revealing an Earth far older than biblical chronology allowed. Astronomy was showing a universe of inconceivable scale. Many thoughtful Victorians were struggling to maintain faith in an age when science seemed to be reducing mystery to mechanism, miracle to natural law. Spiritualism offered a third way. It claimed to be both scientific and spiritual, to provide empirical evidence for the existence of souls and an afterlife through controlled experiments and observable phenomena. Seances were conducted like scientific experiments, with careful protocols, multiple witnesses, written records. The fact that many of these experiments were later revealed as frauds did not dampen the enthusiasm of true believers, who simply concluded that while some mediums were fakes, others were genuine. In parallel to the spiritualist movement, though sometimes overlapping with it, was the emerging field of psychical research. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in London in 1882, represented an attempt to investigate supernatural claims using scientific methodology. The SPR brought together scholars, scientists, and serious investigators who wanted to examine phenomena like telepathy, hauntings, mediumship, and spontaneous paranormal events in a systematic way. The SPR was not composed of credulous believers. Its founders included philosophers like Henry Sidgwick, scholars like Frederick Myers, and scientists like Sir Oliver Lodge. These were serious people applying serious methods to investigate claims that mainstream science dismissed, but that widespread public belief and numerous anecdotal accounts suggested might have some basis in reality. It was this intellectual context that made Mr. Edmund Harrow's investigation of the St. Moor Winna's Bell possible, and that ensured Reverend Penglace's account would be taken seriously by at least some sectors of educated society. The SPR collected hundreds of accounts of spontaneous paranormal phenomena, categorizing them, looking for patterns, trying to separate genuine mysteries from misunderstandings or hoaxes. The St. Moor Winna's case was interesting to psychical researchers for several reasons. First, it involved multiple witnesses over an extended period. This was not a one-time event seen by a single person, but a repeated phenomenon observed by many. Second, it involved a physical object, the bell, whose movement could potentially be measured and studied. Third, it occurred in a church, a place with religious significance, but also a place that could be controlled and investigated. And fourth, There seemed to be a historical dimension to the phenomenon, a connection to actual events in the past, which suggested it might offer insights into how the past could persist or manifest in the present. Several members of the SPR corresponded with Penglace, and at least 3 investigators visited St. Morwenna's between 1888 and 1890. Their reports, preserved in the SPR archives, make for fascinating reading. They generally concluded that the phenomenon appeared to be genuine, that bells were indeed moving and ringing without obvious physical cause, but they could offer no definitive explanation. Some suggested electromagnetic effects related to the geology of the site. Others proposed psychological factors, collective hallucination or suggestion. Still others left the question open, acknowledging mystery without claiming to resolve it. The scientific establishment, meanwhile, was largely skeptical. Mainstream scientists of the 1880s had little patience for claims of supernatural phenomena. Physics, chemistry, and biology were making tremendous strides, and the prevailing view was that the natural world operated according to discoverable laws that made no room for ghosts or spiritual manifestations. The Victorian faith in progress assumed that science would eventually explain everything, that mystery was simply a temporary state resulting from incomplete knowledge. This scientific skepticism was not entirely unreasonable. Many claimed supernatural phenomena had indeed been exposed as frauds. Mediums had been caught using tricks and accomplices to fake spirit communications. Supposed ghost photographs had been revealed as double exposures or deliberate deceptions. The history of supernatural investigation was full of hoaxes, mistakes, and wishful thinking. Scientists had good reason to be suspicious of any claims that defied established physical laws. Yet this skepticism could also be closed-minded, dismissing without investigation anything that did not fit current theories. And there were genuine phenomena that defied easy explanation. Ball lightning, for example, was widely reported but not well understood, and scientists who claimed it was real were sometimes mocked by colleagues who had never witnessed it. Similarly, meteorites were once dismissed as impossible because the idea of stones falling from the sky seemed ridiculous to established scientific thinking. The St. Morwenna's bell existed in this contested space between belief and skepticism, between scientific and spiritual explanations. For every visitor who witnessed the bell ringing and came away convinced of something supernatural, there was another who dismissed it as a trick or a misunderstanding. For every local who believed the bell was rung by the spirits of drowned sailors, there was another who thought there must be some mechanical explanation that simply hadn't been found yet. Reverend Penglace himself embodied this tension. His education had trained him in rational theology and critical thinking. He knew the history of frauds and deceptions. He was aware of how easily people could be fooled, how desperately people wanted to believe in wonders. And yet he had seen what he had seen. He had stood in that bell chamber and watched a massive bronze bell swing with no visible cause. He had ruled out the obvious physical explanations. He had documented the phenomenon carefully and honestly. His position became one of informed agnosticism about mechanism combined with certainty about meaning. He did not know how the bell rang, but he knew it rang. He did not know if it was ghosts or God or geology, but he knew it spoke of remembrance and mystery and the limits of human understanding. And he knew that his proper role as a priest was not to explain the unexplainable, but to help his parishioners find spiritual meaning in their encounter with mystery. The church's official response to the phenomenon was cautious. The bishop of the diocese, when Penglace reported the events, acknowledged the account but did not take a strong position. The Church of England in the Victorian era was navigating difficult waters, trying to maintain traditional faith while accommodating new scientific knowledge, trying to be neither too credulous of supernatural claims nor too dismissive of genuine spiritual experience. The bishop's letter to Penglace, preserved in diocesan archives, captures this careful balance. While I do not doubt your sincere account of these unusual occurrences, I must counsel caution in interpretation. The Church has always taught that miracles are possible, that God can work through natural events in ways we do not understand, and that the spiritual realm is real. However, we must also be wary of enthusiasm and superstition, of mistaking natural phenomena for supernatural ones, of allowing fear or excitement to cloud our judgment. Continue to observe carefully, continue to serve your flock faithfully, and trust that whether the bell rings by natural or supernatural means, God's providence encompasses all. This was, in its way, a very Anglican response. Acknowledge the possibility without insisting on certainty. Maintain the middle way between excessive skepticism and excessive credulity. Focus on faithful service rather than theological controversy. Penglace took the bishop's advice to heart, and the bell's ringing became incorporated into the parish's spiritual life without becoming a point of divisive doctrine. The wider cultural response to the bell varied greatly depending on the source. Popular newspapers, particularly those aimed at working-class readers, tended toward sensational coverage, treating the bell as a ghost story and playing up the dramatic elements. More respectable publications were more measured but still interested, seeing the story as a curiosity that illustrated the tensions between tradition and modernity, between faith and reason, between the old beliefs of rural Cornwall and the newer certainties of urban Britain. Some commentators used the St. Morwenna's bell to make larger points about the state of society. Conservative writers suggested the bell was evidence that modern materialism had gone too far, that in dismissing all spiritual realities as superstition, society had lost touch with important truths. Progressive writers countered that the bell episode showed the dangers of insufficient education, that if rural populations had better scientific training, they would not be so easily impressed by natural phenomena that probably had perfectly ordinary explanations. In Cornwall itself, the response was more personal and immediate. The bell became part of local folklore, woven into the rich tradition of Cornish stories about the supernatural. Other coastal parishes reported similar phenomena, whether genuinely or because suggestion now made people more aware of their own bells and more likely to interpret normal events as supernatural. BST. Morwenna's bell became a point of pride for some Cornish people, proof that their ancient land still held mysteries that the modern world could not fully explain or control. For the parish itself, the meaning of the bell continued to evolve. By the end of the 1880s, the initial fear and alarm had largely given way to acceptance and incorporation. The bell was part of their church, part of their story, part of what made St. Morwenna's unique. When it rang, people still listened, still wondered, still prayed. But they had learned to live with mystery, to make peace with not knowing, to find meaning in the questions rather than demanding answers. And through it all, the 7 sailors remained buried in their unmarked graves, remembered now in ways they had not been for nearly 2 centuries. Whether their spirits had anything to do with the bells ringing, no one could say for certain. But they had been lost and were now found, had been forgotten and were now remembered. And perhaps, in the end, that was the point. Part 7. Across the decades, the 20th century story. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the world changed in ways that would have been unimaginable to those who had first witnessed the St. Morwenna's bell ringing in 1887. The Victorian age, with all its certainties and contradictions, its progress and its poverty, its empire and its inequality, was ending. A new century dawned, bringing new technologies, new wars, new ways of thinking about the world and humanity's place in it. But at St. Morwenna's, perched on its Cornwall headland, time moved more slowly. The church still stood, its granite walls as solid as ever. The bells still hung in the tower, and the tenor bell still rang sometimes when conditions were right, that measured tolling carrying across the parish just as it had for 20 years and more. Reverend Thomas Penglace continued to serve his parish into the new century. He was growing older now, his hair white, his movements slower, but his mind remained sharp and his dedication undiminished. He had become something of a local authority on the bell phenomenon, and visitors still came occasionally to speak with him about it. He always received them courteously, sharing his observations and his journals, never claiming to have solved the mystery, but always willing to discuss it thoughtfully. In 1904, Penglace suffered a stroke. It left him partially paralyzed on one side, and though his mind was unaffected, he could no longer climb the steep stairs to the bell chamber. This grieved him, as he had maintained his habit of occasionally ascending the tower just to sit in the bell chamber and listen, waiting to see if understanding might come. Now that personal vigil was ended, though his interest never waned. He died in 1907, at the age of 73, having served St. Morwenna's for nearly 40 years. His funeral was attended by the entire parish and many from neighboring areas, for he had been widely loved and respected. He was buried in the churchyard, not far from the graves of the 7 unknown sailors, a fact that seemed fitting to those who knew his story. The bells rang for him, rung by living hands in the traditional patterns, sending his soul to heaven with proper ceremony. His successor was a younger man named Reverend James Carlian, recently ordained, full of energy and modern ideas. Carlian had grown up in Plymouth, far from rural Cornwall, and he arrived at St. Morwenna's with somewhat condescending views about country superstitions and backward beliefs. He had heard the stories about the ringing bell, of course, but he attributed them to either fraud or misunderstanding. No bells rang themselves. There had to be a rational explanation, and if his predecessor had been unable to find it, well, perhaps his predecessor had been too close to the situation, too influenced by local credulity. Carlian's skepticism was tested within a month of his arrival. On a stormy November night, the tenor bell rang. He heard it from the vicarage, that unmistakable measured tolling, and his first thought was that someone was playing a prank testing the new vicar. He seized the church keys and hurried to the building, determined to catch the prankster in the act. But the church was locked and empty. He climbed to the bell chamber and found exactly what Penglace had found so many times before. The bell swinging with no visible cause, the mechanism showing no signs of tampering, no possible explanation for the motion. He stood in the cold, dark bell chamber, feeling his certainties crack, and in that moment he gained a new respect for his predecessor. Penglace had not been fooled or mistaken. Something genuinely inexplicable was occurring. To his credit, Carlian adapted quickly. He might not understand the phenomenon, but he could not deny it existed. He began keeping his own journal, documenting his observations. He read Penglace's extensive notes and correspondence. And while he never became as personally invested in the mystery as Penglace had been, he accepted it as part of his parish's unique character and ministry. The early years of the 20th century brought other changes to St. Morwenna's parish. The fishing industry was declining as fish stocks depleted and larger commercial operations based in bigger ports took over the market. Many younger people left for jobs in the cities or emigrated to America or the colonies. The population of the parish shrank, and the church saw fewer baptisms, fewer marriages, fewer of the life events that had filled its calendar for generations. Yet the bell continued to ring, seemingly indifferent to these social changes. It rang through the quiet years before World War I, that last peaceful summer of old Europe before everything changed. It rang during the war itself, those terrible years when young men from even remote Cornwall were called up to fight and die in muddy trenches in France and Belgium. During the war years, some in the parish claimed the bell rang more frequently, and specifically that it rang the night before news arrived of local deaths. William Tregear's grandson, who had learned bell ringing from his grandfather and who was serving with the infantry in France, was killed at Passchendaele in 1917. The story went through the village that the bell had told the night he died, calling him home across the miles and the mud and the horror. Whether this was true or whether memory created the coincidence after the fact is impossible to know. But the story was believed and found comforting, suggesting that even in the impersonal mechanized slaughter of modern war, individual souls were still noted, still mourned, still mattered. The war affected the parish deeply, as it affected all of Britain. Memorials were erected, services held, absences keenly felt. The bell, whether supernatural or not, became associated in many minds with these losses, another way of remembering and honoring the dead. After the war, the practice began of ringing the bells every November 11th at 11 a.m., the moment the armistice took effect. The tenor bell would toll slowly, remembering not just those from the parish, but all the fallen, all the millions who had died in that vast and terrible conflict. The interwar years brought a visit from Mary Tregenza, the folklorist mentioned earlier. Her work documenting Cornish folklore and traditions in the 1920s and 30s included extensive research on this St. Morwenna's bell. She interviewed elderly parishioners who remembered the first ringings in the 1880s, now old men and women whose memories went back to Victorian childhood. She collected variations of the story, noting how it had evolved and changed in the telling, how details had been added or altered, how meaning had shifted. Tregenza's scholarly work on the bell, published in 1935 in a collection titled Phantom Bells and Cornish Traditions, did much to establish this St. Morwenna's case as one of the best documented instances of spontaneous bell ringing in British folklore. She noted that while many churches had stories of bells ringing by themselves, few could match St. Morwenna's for contemporary documentation and witness testimony. Reverend Penglay's journals, which he had donated to the Cornwall County Archives before his death, provided a detailed record that was rare in folklore studies. Tregenza also placed the St. Morwenna's bell in its wider context, connecting it to the rich tradition of Cornish beliefs about the dead and the sea. She noted how Cornwall's maritime culture, with its constant awareness of death by drowning, had created a complex set of customs and beliefs around the souls of the drowned. These included beliefs about death omens, about ghosts of sailors appearing before storms, about phantom ships and bells tolling beneath the waves where the lost land of Lyonesse lay drowned. In this context, Tregenza argued the St. Morwenna's bell was not an isolated oddity, but part of a coherent cultural system for making sense of life and death in a maritime environment. Whether the bell ringing was supernatural or had some natural explanation yet to be discovered was, in her view, less important than what it revealed about how communities created meaning, maintained continuity with the past, and honored their dead. The Second World War brought more profound changes. In 1939, church bells across Britain were silenced by government order. They were to ring only as a warning if Nazi invasion occurred. For 6 years, St. Morwenna's bells were silent, rung by neither living ringers nor mysterious forces. The tower was locked, and the bells waited, mute, through the long years of war. Some older parishioners found this silence almost unbearable. The bells had rung for centuries, marking time, celebrating life, mourning death, calling people to prayer. Their silence felt wrong, ominous, as if something vital had been cut off. And when the tenor bell did not ring even by itself during these years, some wondered if whatever presence or force had caused it to ring had been offended by the enforced silence, had departed, had withdrawn. But when peace came in 1945 and the bells were allowed to ring again, first to celebrate V-Day in May and then VJ Day in August, the pattern reasserted itself. Within weeks, the tenor bell rang by itself one stormy night, as if announcing its return, confirming its presence. And the parish, now much smaller than it had been at the start of the century, but still there, still faithful, was oddly relieved. The bell was back. This strange, inexplicable part of their heritage had survived even the silence of war. The post-war years brought continued decline to rural Cornwall. The fishing industry that had sustained the coast for centuries was now barely viable. The farms struggled to compete with larger commercial operations. Young people left in greater numbers than ever. By the 1960s, St. Moor Parish had a permanent population of less than 100, with the church conducting services only twice a month, the vicar now covering 3 parishes instead of 1. Yet tourism was growing. Cornwall was being discovered as a holiday destination, its rugged coast and quaint villages attracting visitors seeking escape from urban life. And some of these visitors, hearing about the mysterious bell, made pilgrimages to St. Moor. The church began appearing in guidebooks, not for its architecture, which was fine but not exceptional, but for its story. The bell that rings alone became a minor tourist attraction. This brought mixed feelings to the parish. Some welcomed the attention and the few pounds tourists might spend in the local shop or pub. Others found it intrusive, a commercialization of something sacred, a transformation of genuine mystery into entertainment. Debates arose about whether to charge admission to the church, whether to sell postcards or souvenirs, whether to embrace or resist the parish's newfound role as a curiosity. Reverend Carlian, who had served the parish for over 50 years, died in 1959. His successor, and the succession of vicars who followed through the 1960s and 70s, tended to stay only a few years before moving on to larger parishes. None developed the deep connection to St. Moor that Penglace and Carlian had, and none took much interest in the bell phenomenon. They conducted services, performed their duties, and moved on. The bell became just another aspect of parish life, noted but not investigated, accepted but not deeply engaged with. The 1970s and 80s brought a new wave of interest from paranormal investigators. These were different from the spiritualists and psychical researchers of earlier eras. This new generation came with tape recorders and electromagnetic field meters, with infrared cameras and other electronic equipment. They were influenced by new ideas about psychic phenomena, about energy fields and vibrations, about the possibility of recording or measuring supernatural events. Several groups investigated St. Moor during these decades. Most found nothing unusual except during those rare occasions when the bell actually rang, and even then their equipment recorded only what human senses detected, a bell moving and ringing. No electromagnetic anomalies, no significant temperature changes, no mysterious energies. The bell rang, but the instruments could find no cause. One investigation in 1983, conducted by a university parapsychology department, did produce interesting results. Using sophisticated vibration sensors attached directly to the bell and the tower structure, they recorded one instance of the bell ringing. Their equipment clearly showed the bell moving, the vibrations propagating through the structure, the sound waves producing the tolling that human ears heard. But the sensors showed no initiating impulse, no triggering vibration that set the bell in motion. The bell simply started moving, as if the energy to move it came from nowhere or from somewhere their instruments could not detect. The researchers published their findings in a parapsychology journal, noting the anomaly but offering no explanation. They could not prove anything supernatural, but they had documented something that defied normal understanding of cause and effect. The paper attracted little attention outside specialist circles, but it remains one of the few pieces of modern scientific documentation of the St. Morwenna's phenomenon. By the end of the 20th century, St. Morwenna's was facing the same crisis as many rural British churches: declining congregation, aging building, insufficient funds for maintenance. The tower, in particular, was showing signs of serious structural problems. Centuries of Atlantic storms had taken their toll. Cracks had developed in the masonry. Water was getting in, causing damage to the wooden structures that held the bells. A major restoration was needed, but the money was not there. A campaign was launched in the 1990s to raise funds for the tower restoration. This brought renewed interest in the church and its story, and the bell phenomenon was featured prominently in fundraising materials. Whether this was appropriate use of a spiritual mystery for practical fundraising purposes was debated, but the campaign was ultimately successful. Grants from heritage organizations, donations from across Britain, and even from overseas, contributions from visitors who have been touched by the church and its story, all combined to raise the necessary funds. The restoration work began in 1997 and continued for several years. The tower was essentially taken apart and rebuilt, stone by stone, with hidden modern reinforcements ensuring its stability for decades to come. The bells were removed and sent to a specialist foundry for cleaning and minor repairs, though they were found to be in good condition despite their age. During the years when the bells were absent from the tower, something interesting was reported. Several parishioners and visitors claimed to hear the tolling on stormy nights, even though the bells were physically elsewhere, in a foundry miles away. These reports were impossible to verify and might have been imagination or suggestion, but they echoed what had been reported during the World War II silence, suggesting that whatever the phenomenon was, it might not be entirely dependent on the physical presence of the bells themselves. When the restoration was complete in 2000, a grand rededication service was held. The bishop attended, bells were rung by expert ringers in full peal. The event was covered by local media. It was a celebration of heritage preserved, of community coming together, of faith maintained across the centuries. That night, as if in response or recognition or welcome, the tenor bell rang by itself. The slow, measured toll carried across the village, and those who heard it smiled. The bell was home. The mystery continued. After more than a century, the pattern held. And so our journey through the mystery of St. Morwenna's bell comes to its end, though the story itself continues even now. The church still stands on its windswept headland. The bells still hang in their tower. And sometimes, when conditions are right, when storms blow in from the Atlantic and the night is dark, the tenor bell still rings, that measured tolling carrying across the moors and over the waves, speaking in its bronze voice about memory and loss, about the persistence of the past, about the mysterious connections between the living and the dead, the known and the unknown. What are we to make of this story? After thousands of words, after exploring every angle and aspect, what conclusions can we draw? Perhaps the only honest answer is the one Reverend Penglace reached over a century ago. We do not know, and perhaps we are not meant to know. Some mysteries exist to humble us, to remind us that for all our knowledge and technology, for all our scientific understanding and rational thinking, the world still contains things that defy our categories and resist our explanations. Does the bell ring because of some undiscovered natural phenomenon, some quirk of geology or meteorology or physics that we simply have not yet understood? Perhaps. Science is always discovering new things, and what seems impossible in one era becomes accepted fact in the next. Maybe someday, someone will figure out exactly what causes the bell to move and ring, and the mystery will be solved through mathematics and observation. Or does the bell ring because of something genuinely supernatural, because the souls of 7 drowned sailors or some other presence makes it ring, calling out across the centuries, asking to be remembered? Perhaps. The world's religious and spiritual traditions, across all cultures and all times, have consistently maintained that reality is more than just matter and energy, that there are souls and spirits and presences that exist beyond what science can measure. Maybe the bell is evidence that these traditions are right, that the material world is not all there is. Or perhaps the bell rings for reasons we do not yet have categories to describe, operating according to principles that are neither purely physical nor purely spiritual, but something else, something for which we have no vocabulary and no framework. Perhaps the universe is stranger than we imagine, full of dimensions and forces and possibilities that our current understanding cannot even conceive of. Whatever the truth, the St. Morwenna's bell reminds us of something important, that wonder is still possible in our modern world, that mystery has not been banished by science or reason or progress. And perhaps that is the real gift of the bell, not an answer but a question, not an explanation, but an invitation to remain curious, to stay humble, to acknowledge the limits of our understanding while celebrating the vastness of creation. Thank you for taking this journey with me tonight, through the mists of Cornwall and the mysteries of time, exploring this strange and beautiful story of a bell that rings alone. I hope these words have carried you gently towards sleep, have given your mind something to ponder as you drift into dreams, have reminded you that the world is full of wonders if we only take time to notice them. If you've enjoyed this episode of Mystic Sleep Tales, I would be so grateful if you would subscribe to our channel. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss future explorations of mystical events from around the world. Every subscription helps us continue creating these stories for you, these journeys into the mysterious and unexplained. I'm always curious to know where our listeners are tuning in from. Are you falling asleep in Singapore as the sun rises? Starting your evening in Mexico City? Finding a quiet moment in the middle of your day in Berlin? Wherever you are and whatever time it is, please leave a comment letting me know. I love seeing how far these stories travel, how they connect people across oceans and time zones, creating a community of curious souls who find comfort in mystery. And if you have stories of your own to share, I want to hear them. Do you come from a place with unexplained phenomena, with local legends, with events that defy easy explanation? Have you experienced something yourself that you've never quite been able to make sense of? Share your stories in the comments. Your experience might inspire a future episode, might help someone else feel less alone with their own encounters with the mysterious, might add another thread to the grand tapestry of human wonder and curiosity. These stories we tell, these mysteries we explore, they're all part of the same ancient human impulse to make sense of our world, to connect with something larger than ourselves, to find meaning in the darkness. Whether we're gathered around a fire 10,000 years ago or connected through screens and satellites today, we're still doing the same thing, sharing stories, seeking understanding, finding comfort in the knowledge that we're not alone in our questions or a wonder. Until next time, sleep well, dream deeply, and remember that the world is larger and stranger and more wonderful than we can ever fully know. The mysteries remain, calling softly through the night, and we are all listeners, all seekers, all travelers through the dark, following the sound of bells that ring in the distance, leading us towards something we might never fully understand but can always appreciate. The bells ring on. The mysteries endure. And somewhere, on a headland in Cornwall, waves crash against ancient cliffs, wind howls through granite stones, and when the conditions are right, a bell tolls slowly in the darkness, speaking its bronze language to anyone who will listen. Good night, wherever you are in this vast and mysterious world. May your sleep be peaceful, your dreams be vivid, and may you always remain open to the possibility of wonder.